afternoon. Nice to see everybody. Sort of feels like an interminable in light of our strategic priorities and planning and figure out, how we manage them. I don't have a strong sense of timeline, and I don't think we do at the agency either. Bill, Anita, we don't really know, do we?
We had a phone call with the feds just last week where they were sharing with us some of the potential timeline and things that might be happening, but they didn't have a dollar value to give us yet.
Okay.
In that phone call.
Okay, great. Well, we'll stay tuned and we'll be nimble and ready when we hear. On the CCDBG, I just wanted to let you know that we had struck the ad hoc as a way to start moving that work along on a channel with the board. We're sort of in the position to step back a little. It's a very large project for the agency. It's also critical that we do the work on CCBG in the context of our strategic work and discussions. So the commissioner and I have that agenda item first up next week in a one-on-one, and we're going to sort of take a moment to step back and say, in light of everything else that's happening, how do we want to think about that CCDBG work in light of the board's advisement and how the board might be helpful. So just an update. We're sort of we haven't had a meeting, Sheila, in a little while, and we will regroup and think that through. And I'll look forward today to a couple of conversations, one about the PEG and the second about where we're at with the CCDF state plan. Welcome, Allison. Any questions or comments for me generally? I'll also give an update on fiscal from last week in a moment. Rudy, okay? Great. Secretary?
I will pass, Madam Chair, if that's okay.
That is fine. We have one person from the public who's signed up for comment, Greater Boston Legal Services, Naomi Meyer. Welcome.
Thank you. Somehow I thought I wouldn't be the only one, but it's starting to rain, so maybe that deterred people. So my name is Naomi Meyer. I'm with Greater Boston Legal Services. And as you know, my colleagues at GBLS and I have submitted a letter addressing a number of concerns that were raised by the proposed changes to the child care subsidy regulations as we could see them in the January 8th PowerPoint that was presented to this board. And today I wanted to just take a couple minutes to talk about one of those concerns in particular. The proposed use of variances instead of actual policies to handle common situations. The PowerPoint proposed that EEC adopt case-by-case decision-making in the form of variances for entire categories of care, including homeless child care where a parent has a serious disability, and child care where a parent is pursuing a HISET. And so we find this approach problematic on both legal and sort of practical grounds. On the legal side, the State Administrative Procedures Act and decades of legal precedent say that if an agency is going to impose a rule, the public and especially the people affected by that rule need to be informed of what that rule says. The law requires that eligibility rules be set forth by regulation, promulgated with advance notice and public comment. And this means that eligibility for a government program can't be left to discretionary case-by-case decisions made without clear standards, even if those making the decisions are very well-intentioned. And in fact, EEC's current written policy on variances reflect this, indicating they're intended to be used only in highly unusual circumstances that fall out of established policies. The Financial Assistance Guide says variances are applicable in extenuating circumstances where lack of child care would result in extreme hardship or would place an already at-risk child in greater harm. defines the extraordinary circumstances that might warrant a variance to include the death of a family member, natural disasters, and situations where loss of care could actually result in a child going into DCF custody. So quite extreme circumstances. The proposed limits to these categories of care, absent a variance, are also problematic on a more practical level. The homeless families that we serve are routinely in shelters for 2 years or more while they wait for affordable housing. And so cutting off childcare while they remain homeless will impede parents' ability to engage in housing search and other activities that will lead to stability. It will also disrupt children's relationships with childcare providers. And since homelessness itself is traumatic for children, the stability of childcare and the relationships a child has in the childcare setting are vital to the child's long-term chances of success. Similarly, for parents with a disability severe enough to constitute a service need, there is no reason to think that disability is going to be cured at the end of 2 years, unfortunately. EEC has raised a concern about the lack of reevaluations of the disability service need and suggested that limiting it to 2 years was necessary to prevent abuse of the system. But we think this problem could be readily addressed by simply reviewing eligibility every 12 months without imposing arbitrary cutoffs. The January PowerPoint also proposed 1-year limits on high-set programs counting toward the service need, subject again to possible variances. And as board members recognized at the January meeting, there are valid reasons a parent may need more than a year to complete a high school equivalency, depending on the educational level at which they're starting, as well as their learning profile and other needs. So allowing more than 1 year only by variance would end up being arbitrary and unfair. If a parent were not appropriately pursuing or participating in a program, they wouldn't have enough hours to establish a service need anyway. So we think that existing requirements are sufficient to address any concern about the appropriate use of this service need. So in short, our concern is that subjecting all homeless families, disabled parents, and parents in high-set programs to a variance process if they have a continuing service need can only lead to arbitrary decisions based on individual discretion. This is unfair to families and children, and it's inconsistent with our administrative procedures law. And so we urge that EEC ensure it has clear policies that meet families' needs and that let them know when they qualify for childcare. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your correspondence. We're certainly paying attention.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. All right, we'll move to the minutes from our last meeting, the February 13th meeting. Any suggestions, edits, corrections to the minutes? They seem fine to me. Everybody okay? Mm-hmm. Motion to approve the minutes of February 13th.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Abstentions? Opposed? Thanks. All right, I can make a brief fiscal update. I'll ask Dave and Mary and Bill to chime in if I miss anything. A few general updates, and then I'll say a little about our agenda items. The first, which is really good news, Bill and his team let us know that the teacher qualifications unit is now processing almost the same week as the applications are received, and that's partly the personnel strategy. We had the 2 FTEs added to that group, which is good news for the field, now working on those with incomplete applications. The second is the scope of work for the transportation. The next phase of transportation study is being formed, and the real goal is to bring a little more data to that conversation and some modeling and some financials so that we can have a next conversation about transportation with a little more concrete information. The third, which was our second agenda item, is the market rate study is now in the field. It looks and feels quite different from prior years in that it's a very significant effort on the survey, the sampling design and the survey itself. It's a census-based, it's strata by region and type, and so it stands to provide probably more precise information than in years past by as opposed to what you get with a random sample. So it was a good discussion. I thought that it was clear that the methodology is very strong. There's some oversampling in places that have high income discrepancy, which is helpful to us to try to think about market rates. And so overall, I thought it was a good discussion, and it's clear that it's very comprehensive and a departure from past years in that regard. So we'll stay tuned for that. And finally, the only other agenda item was the caseload review, which was pretty straightforward. We continue to run a surplus, not totally surprising from these prior years, monitoring that, and also at the same time, the agency is working with EOE and A&F to think about the projection strategies in light of this pattern, and it also has implications for the bids that may go out in order to say to ourselves, to the agency to say to itself, how is the market using the different types of mechanisms for care. Dave, Mary, anything to add to our update?
I think I would just add, we did have a bit of a discussion about the wait list and sort of
Right,
the challenges that the wait list
Right.
presents both to the office
Yeah.
as well as to the field, frankly. And while we don't have a solution because it's very complex issues, I think, we did explore some thoughts about that. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, you're right, we did, yeah. And it's one, it would, all that it left me with was a reminder that we may want to revisit that. I realize we have a lot of strategic work on the go, but at some point, we may want to think about the wait list in terms of the way that it's both designed and administered, if you will, to help the agency and the field. It's a funny number, as we've discussed in the past, in terms of what it represents.
Can I ask you a question? What were 2 or 3 challenges that were thrown up?
Around the wait list? Well, the main conversation, and Bill, you should chime in, the main issue, of course, is that folks get on in a fairly straightforward and perhaps less precise manner, and until their name comes up, they're sort of on this wait list, and we count them on a wait list, and then many are ineligible when it comes around. And so, there's a sense that, there's some disappointment on the family side. There's a sense that our wait list doesn't actually represent the right population, right? It's not a close match to who ought to be on it. And then Mary raises this issue, the kind of perpetual issue that, there's a lot of paper involved and time involved in trying to fill the slot. Meanwhile, providers will have a family there, the job is there, the voucher's in hand, and we can't get the spot, right? So there's a few things to think about, but primarily it seems that we may, as board, in partnership with the agency, want to ask ourselves about the way in which one gets on the wait list.
Okay, thank you.
And there is only one wait list for all ages.
Right. Right.
Are you
No.
asking the question, or
No,
are you
making a
say,
statement.
making a
I'm
statement?
checking.
Yeah.
No, I'm checking that my understanding is correct, because that has been an issue for a long time of should we separate
It's not
the 5
differentiated.
years and younger from the 5 years and older.
Bill, do you have anything to add?
It's only one wait list. It's for people eligible for the IE caseload. DTA and DCF children come to us differently, referred to us directly by those agencies for assistance. I would only add that part of this discussion was born out of the fact that because of the recent effort of the Child Care Resource and Referral Agencies on putting the vouchers out on the street, the 2,300 vouchers, which, by the way, they hit 100% this week. So that was achieved by the deadline. Because of their efforts, the wait list is now down at about 17,500 people, which is the lowest it's been in quite some time. But their marketing efforts show that they're now marketing to families from approximately, among the 7 of them, April to November 2017. So one has to consider 17,000 families on the wait list against that most current within a year marketing, and what does that mean in the context of what the chairperson has said. So looking at how people get on the wait list and then how we market to them and save money in marketing, because as you approach them, you're spending money for not all people being eligible. I think are challenges to take on in the next year.
Right.
Makes sense.
It also means that, like, what we might want to think through is a better understanding of who's waiting for care, right? And how do we understand who they are, at which ages, et cetera. But it would demand a different intake process.
And just to keep in mind that it is a very transient population, so almost immediately, a lot of the data
Right.
changes on that wait.
Right, and we're in a paper format, a mailing format, which is something else to think through. Thank you. Let's turn to our 2 items, starting with the preschool expansion grant presentation of the interim findings of the evaluation. I want to welcome the team from ABD and Jocelyn and Sarah as well. Do you want to just introduce the team, Jocelyn?
Sure. I'm Jocelyn Bound. I've met most of you. And Sarah Volkanov is my colleague working on the preschool expansion grant at EEC. And we have Barbara Didson and Amy Checkaway from APT here today as well. So thank you all for hearing this presentation. We're very excited to share the results of the impact evaluation that we have designed to look at the impacts that this program has had on children in the preschool expansion grant program in year 2. So this is children that were in PEG last year. That was the second year of the grant. And just to give a quick overview of the agenda, we will look at the context for the impact study. So we're going to review the PEG model and look at some of the implementation findings from year 2, and then discuss the design of the impact study, present the findings overall for statewide, and also share some exploratory analysis that we've conducted to look at variation and impacts, and then present some next steps that we're considering for this evaluation work and leave time for discussion.
Can I ask a question? That
Sure.
will help frame it? Already?
Haven't even got off the cover,
But
you know?
me. Yeah. Are we going to talk about it for the PEG grant or also any implications for other EEC work? Because I think eventually we want to get to that, but the focus is going to be.
So the presentation is going to focus on the impact results, but I think we should feel free in the discussion and as questions come up to think about the implications of what we're finding.
Thanks, okay. I did.
Open for business at the end.
And throughout, I mean, we can certainly talk about some of these issues as they come up. So just to review the history of the PEG grant in Massachusetts, this is a federal grant that Massachusetts received at the end of 2014, along with many other states. The intent of the federal grant was to encourage states to expand access to high-quality pre-kindergarten classrooms to low-income children, and to improve collaborations between early education providers and public school districts with an eye to thinking about system alignment in the early education space. There were a number of eligibility and programmatic requirements that have shaped this model, and Massachusetts took those requirements and then built our own model on top of them. So starting with the eligibility requirements, we are working in 5 communities in Massachusetts with Boston, Holyoke, Lawrence, Lowell, and Springfield. There is a residency requirement that children need to be resident in those communities to be eligible. The federal expectation is that families would be below 200% of the federal poverty level. When we looked at the enrollment of year 2 families, we found that 68% were reporting incomes that would have a family of 4 below the poverty level, so 100% or below. Children need to be eligible for kindergarten in the following year, so that effectively creates an age cutoff, which is very important for the design of our evaluation.
There's a foreshadowing there, right?
So as of September 1st, children need to be 4 to enter the PEG program. Massachusetts, in an effort to focus this program on expanding access, included a requirement that children could not have any prior early education experience to be eligible with this. Early in the discussions of what this program would look like, we received some pushback from communities who said this may be challenging, particularly Boston, where the argument was made that there is a great deal of access to early education programming in Boston, but the Boston community wanted to focus on improving quality. So we did allow Boston to enroll children with early education experience. In other communities, there were some challenges in early enrollment. Extensive outreach was required to find children who had no early education experience and to explain to families why a pre-kindergarten experience could be very important to their child. Programs were also reporting that they encountered many children who had very inconsistent engagement with early education programs, so they weren't eligible, but they were not necessarily currently in a program. So we did provide some flexibility in year 2 for programs to roll up to 20% of their slots with children who had had some prior early education experience. We did find in year 2, 70% of the enrolled children had no prior preschool experience. And then programs are also expected to serve dual language learners and children with special needs. 43% of the children enrolled in year 2 reported speaking a language other than English at home. And just under 6% of the children enrolled had an IEP by the end of year 2. The design that Massachusetts put in place really focused on building the community level collaborations. We granted to the local school districts in each of these 5 communities, and then the school districts sub-granted to a group of what we called early learning providers, or ELPs. These were EEC licensed programs. Every community included a Head Start program. The LEAs, or the public schools, provided the grant management and oversight. They also played a facilitation role in managing the collaboration. And the ELPs provided most of the direct services to children, with the exception of some of the professional development supports and special education services to children with IEPs. One of the first requirements of the PEG grant was that communities create a structure for collaborative decision making, and this started in January of the year that we received the grant in 2014, so starting in the beginning of 2015, local groups were convened with representation from leadership from all of the collaborating agencies to form steering committees and first design and plan the program, which then opened in September of 2015. And steering committees continue to meet at least monthly to review data, review issues that have arisen, and make program adjustments as needed. In many communities, there's also executive committees that meet quarterly to think a little bit more strategically about where the program is and what directions it's going in. And subcommittees have also been developed to focus on specific programmatic issues, most commonly professional development and the provision of family engagement and comprehensive services. And these groups provide an opportunity to really think about the coordination of these services, for example, thinking about the coordination and alignment of training and coaching for teachers in these communities, and similarly the family engagement and comprehensive services provided. And then each of these communities was required to be in compliance with a set of quality requirements. These were laid out at the beginning of the grant. The program was designed around them, and then we've been monitoring in an ongoing fashion to ensure that these are maintained. This program was designed to be a full year, full day program, so programs have to be open at least 8 hours a day for 12 months of a year. The maximum class size allowed is 20, and the child-teacher ratio is 10-to-1. However, it's important to note that we have found in most of these communities they've moved towards a 3-teacher model in their classroom, so they have 3 teachers. For each classroom, it provides some freedom for teachers to leave the classroom without requiring coverage for meeting with a coach, going to a training, and also does lower the ratios for part of the day, at least, for children. All programs are required to use Teaching Strategies Gold as a formative assessment and to implement a curriculum that is aligned with our state standards and has some evidence base for it. We didn't specify a curriculum or even a set of curriculum for programs to choose from. Everybody made their own choices, nor did we require that all the classrooms in one community use the same curriculum. In some communities, everybody is using the same curriculum, and others, the ELPs are picking their own curriculum, generally using curriculum that they've used in the past and are familiar with. All programs are expected to achieve QRIS level 4 by the end of the grant, or NACE accreditation and a level 3. Lead teachers are required to have a BA in a relevant field and be paid a salary that's commensurate with the public school. And there's extensive professional development supports that are expected. The subcommittees that are talking about are generally the organization that plans the support for teachers. It's included a coherent focus on, increasingly a coherent focus on thinking about how the training, the coaching, and other job-embedded supports are supporting teachers in the implementation of the curriculum. We've conducted a fair number of classroom quality observations, and that data has informed the development of the supports for teachers as well. And I'm not going to go through the slide. This is actually in your appendix in a slightly different form. It was very hard to do this presentation without at least providing some place to think about the variation across all of these different local programs. You can see here the differences in size and also in organization. In particular, what stands out is just physically the way the programs are organized is very different. In Boston, you have individual, in most programs, individual PEG classrooms integrated into ongoing programs that serve children from birth to kindergarten. In Holyoke, you have individual classrooms located within Holyoke Public Schools, elementary schools. Lawrence, each ELP has opened their own program, and they're running 2 different PEG sites. In Lowell, they have one site that is run jointly by the 2 ELPs, and by year 2, they had implemented a system of transportation to ensure that children had access to this program citywide. In Springfield Public Schools is running an early education site, and many of the PEG classrooms from all 3 of the partners are located there. But there are also satellite classrooms and other ongoing programs that each of the partners locates, each of the partners run. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Amy and Barbara to talk about some of the findings, first from the implementation study and then the impacts.
Great. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of context before we dive into the impact study, which is really what we want to make sure to share findings from with you today. But as those of you who have heard us talk in prior presentations know, we have been gathering very sort of consciously and systematically trying to gather a lot of implementation data as well, which is quite informative. And I'm just going to quickly review several particularly important levers of classroom quality that I think are important to understand in terms of implementation and variation across PEG classrooms in year 2. We're going to be talking about some of these more later in the context of some of the exploratory analyses. For those of you who are interested, there's also a lot more of the implementation side of things that we collected in year 2 that's actually available in a report from year 2. So we don't want to spend too much time on all the details of that today, but I'm happy to share more, and we'll be talking about that later as well. So this is just a little bit of a snapshot of some implementation components in year 2, particularly focused on teachers' supports, educator supports, since some of our exploratory analyses in particular start to dive into some of those. I think the key point here in the context of the impact study, also in the context of implementation, is that there's there continues to be a lot of variation, not surprisingly, across classrooms, across communities, within communities, in terms of the intensity, in terms of the focus and content, and in terms of even the perceived usefulness of some of these supports. And so I think it was intentional that communities be able to create their own model, and ELPs or the community agencies have had flexibility to really figure out what's best for their teachers and their families, and not surprisingly, that results in variation, not only in the curricula used, but also in terms of the focus and how much of what teachers are getting. We did find in year 2 that leadership at the community and the program level seemed to have made noticeable adjustments in terms of expanding and intensifying in particular, well, both the educator supports and the family supports, and offered them more evenly across their staff as well. We had collected data, and I know in the first year there had been less of some of these supports for assistant teachers. We found a lot more consistency actually in what the assistant teachers were receiving in terms of professional development and coaching in year 2, and I think that may be continuing. We're still gathering data in year 3 now, since we're already there. There were also efforts made, as Jocelyn just mentioned, to adjust the focus to try to achieve more intentional alignment across the professional development training, the coaching, and the instructional approaches that were being supported in the classroom. Just a note, in year 2, half of PEGLE teachers also reported participating in formal teacher networks or professional learning communities, which may be a powerful way potentially to sort of both put into place and sustain improvements. So just some notes of what was happening in year 2.
Amy, can I just ask
yeah.
a quick clarifying question?
Of course.
I was going to ask you about PLCs or professional learning communities. Do you find that they're tracking with the coaching, or that's a group, like, is there overlap then with those who are engaged in coaching also engaging in PLC, or is it I'm either doing coaching or PLC? So for the 1/3, do we have a sense?
So we could have a sense of that. I don't know that we have looked at that in particular yet from the
Okay,
teacher
all right.
survey, but we
Yeah.
have both of those things that we could look at together, and it's a good question. I will write down right now. Okay. So about a year ago, for those of you who are here, we actually presented the year 2 class scores. Again, class being a global measure, well-respected measure of classroom quality, particularly focusing on interactions that are happening in the classroom between the teachers and the students. I think, again, the important thing to keep in mind when you look at this is really both the overall average, which, as we talked about last time, is sort of consistent with other studies. On average, classrooms in PEG are on the high end for classroom organization and emotional support. On average, they're in sort of the moderate range in instructional support, which is a lot harder to boost up. And the vertical line, I was about to say horizontal, really shows the range in scores for both the total score, but each of the domains. So a range of from 3 to 6, 3 to 6 or 3 to 7 for 2 of the 3 domains, classroom organization and emotional support, and from 1-ish all the way up to 5.5 for instructional support. I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara. This was just sort of some context on the implementation side. And I can either do this, or you'll have to tell me when to advance.
So I know this isn't quite like the big reveal since you already have had the slides. It's going to lose a little of its kind of excitement of impact. But I do want to say 2 things to help us sort of move the thought forward. One is, I don't think right now we're at a loss for data in early childhood about whether we can make early childhood make a difference for children at the end of preschool. I think this study has something very particular about it, PEG, and it's the way the program model was set up that is new to the field, and that has to do with the context of having decided as a state to try a mixed delivery system for some of the same kinds of programmatic features that have been characteristic of the public school pre-Ks, where we have seen a lot of the research. I know there are other questions that dog the field now, particularly about fade out and what happens to kids once they get into kindergarten. And this study, as it is right now, is not speaking to that. I think we have some planned follow-up of these kids that will not be in this same kind of rigorous study design. But I do think this is not just a repeat of saying, well, this is just one more good thing we've learned about early childhood. There's some very particular things we've learned here, which I think is very exciting, and will make this study, I think, of national interest, because it's a first in many ways. So just to kind of pique your engagement, we're gonna go forward here. And the other thing, it's fine, we're here. It's okay, no, it's okay. The kind of design we're talking about, we might not spend this much time in a public discussion about what the design is, because, it's like, how interesting is that, only to some of us. But this particular design is now well known in the field, and it is a way people have approached trying to look at early childhood programs in a rigorous way. And there are certainly controversies about this design. Any conference you go to, there's someone speaking about our worries about these kind of designs. So I think I just want to get you up to speed so when you're at your next, party and you say, well, we did an RD in Massachusetts, and someone says, well, I heard that they really have problems. You can say, I do know what you're talking about. So I think we're all going to share in this understanding. And it's not that this study is different or wrong compared to other RD studies, but all RD studies have a certain worry. And so we're going to spend a little time on that just so we know what to be cautious of, what to be very cautious about, and what we can say with some confidence. So these were the core research questions, and when I say core, it means these are the questions the study was really designed and powered to answer. So we have to be honest about that. These are the questions that when we're done looking at the data, we can say we have some confidence in what this study contributed to these answers. And the reason we feel more confident is it takes account of the full sample. We haven't cut it in any way. We haven't looked at subgroups. This is the whole state or the whole PEG program in this in these that can answer these questions. And so we looked at impacts on 4 important domains of children's development. And I want to say this is not anything unusual. This is very typical of what more comprehensive early childhood studies look at. They look at early literacy, early math, something about language development, usually some kind of vocabulary measure, and then a measure of executive function, which you'll learn is sort of all over the place in terms of measures. That's not as far along, or we're not as we don't have the same idea of what's the best and most common measure to use. So these questions about what is the impact of the PEG program overall on these 4 domains, those are the key study questions. But because we always jump to these questions, because it is what makes them more interesting to people who do policy or who are designing programs. People want to know, well, what's accounting? Did everyone get the same result? And if not, what accounts for the difference? Is it just sort of random, or do we know why? And does that help us think about either program improvement or program targeting, or as a state, what to invest in? So we went down this road with some caution, because this is not what the study was designed to answer. But as long as we're kind of in this room and we can share an understanding of being cautious, we're going to present all these data to you so you can sort of see the same kind of data we're looking at to understand where there might be patterns of interest, where we're something that's consistent so we feel a little better about it. It's not sort of a one-off finding in some very small subsample. And so we have looked at variation in impacts for different types of children, for different types of programs or classrooms, and for the community. And the community question is one that is not typically addressed in other RD studies, because they don't have the same kind of model that Massachusetts has, where you had a small number of communities that were allowed to use them, to have a lot of variation around the model. And that is a question of interest to the state, even though we answer it with less confidence. But that question has not been asked by, I think, any other RD in the same way. So here we go. Here we go into the design, and we're all going to be able to say now we know what a regression discontinuity design is. And the important thing is that word discontinuity, because what you're looking for is a discontinuity between the relationship of the program to outcomes for kids who have the program and who don't have the program. As you know, in most studies, we either look at the same kids over time, or we look at 2 different groups, and they've been assigned in a way that we feel really comfortable. A randomized study is what we all think is sort of the gold standard, but we've not been able to carry that off very well in early childhood, because what parent do you know who's going to allow their child to be randomly assigned to a program? You pick the program for many reasons, and you are not up for that. And I have very few random assignment studies in early childhood. It used to be easier also, because when you randomly assign kids, the other kids got nothing. It's sort of rare to find this group. So people have been a little struggling with what is a rigorous way to address the question of the impact of a program like PEG or like any other early childhood program. So there is this regression discontinuity design did not start with early childhood, but that we have borrowed it from other fields. And do any of you know the Reading First study? It's sort of a very famous study, and it's a really good example of an RD study that's a little easier to understand. That is, every school that wanted the money had to apply, and they got a score. Like how many kids do they have in need, how many teachers do they have, and so they actually got a score, and then the program said, all right, anybody above this score gets money, anybody below this score doesn't get money. But if you were the program that had 1 point below the score, you'd think, well, what's different about me than Amy, who got the program? We're only 1 point difference. But once you set that cutoff, it's almost like a random assignment. It's almost like I'm saying, you two got the same score. I'm randomly giving Amy the program and you not, Barb, but we're 1 point off. So right next to that score, it's like a random assignment study. And as you must understand, the further you get from that score, like the people who didn't get one but were 10 points lower or 10 points higher, they're not maybe as similar as Amy and I are, because there's a reason. So these really all depend on having this thing called a cut point. Sometimes they call it a running variable. If you want to be very sophisticated, you can say age is the running variable in our kind of study. I always kind of like it because I, of course, have a Walt Disney-esque version of something running. Oh, did this come up? Did you do this, or did I hit this with my hand?
I did, because,
Oh, okay.
but I thought you
I
was reading your mind.
I think it's like the lights on a party going on. Okay, move along. Okay, so here's Amy and I, and in early childhood, it's a birth date. We have a birth date, and that's because kindergartens now have a very firm starting age, which they didn't used to have. People can make a lot of choices about when their children want, start kindergarten. And then PEG has an eligibility criteria that is very firm. So if I am 1 day below my 4th birthday on September 1st, I can't go to PEG. Amy, who just turned 4 that day, can go to PEG. But what's the difference between us? You assume there's not a lot. Both our parents wanted into PEG. We both are eligible for PEG. I'm just 1 day younger than Amy. So this is what early childhood RD, regression discontinuities, do. They all use age as their running variable. And so, again, there's the two. We had some colleague who actually had 2 people get up and act this out. Is there a reason the other part there? Thank you. Oh, animation. Okay, so Amy and I could have given our script. So the child on the left just turned 4, so he has to wait till next year because he turned 4 on September 2nd. The child on the right turned 4 on September 1st. In every other way, they're probably very similar, and we can assume they're similar in terms of looking at their outcomes. The differences between those children are not related to whether they got PEG or not. It's related to something else. The day their mother actually went to the hospital and had them, we don't know. So that's what a regression discontinuity study is. But the problem is, we usually don't have samples big enough that the whole sample is made up of children born 1 day before the cutoff and 1 day after. If we had gigantic samples of kids and we could only have those kids, it would be as good as a randomized study. The problem is we take all the kids who weren't eligible and all the kids that were eligible, and they stretch out for a year on either side. And the further away you get from that age point, the less firmly we believe that those kids are exactly the same. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. You're going to be tested on this at the end, okay? This table's going to have to be the PEG group. This is going to be the control group. You have to stand up and give your script here. So, and that's the reason people worry about these designs, because they aren't really as good a design as they could be if we could just model right next to the cut point. So, again, instead of just looking at all the kids mean versus other mean, we do it like we look at the treatment effect for one group, the treatment effect for the other group, and then we say, even though they're different kids or different ages, we think that they are similar enough that we can actually compare the outcomes of the kids who got PEG and the outcomes of the kids who didn't get PEG. So when we talk about being careful, what people with this design do is they do lots of different analyses by how far away you are from the cut point. So I could say I could put everybody in, that's my biggest sample, but it's also my most loose sample on the ends. Or I can do an analysis that only brings in the kids who are closer to the cut point. Guess what's wrong with that? It's smaller, it's not as powerful. So you're trading off the sort of the hewing to this very close design versus having the power to find things. That's what you're going to hear me say over and over again. We did both of these, and you can join with us in looking at how things change when we change that bandwidth, okay? Does that make sense as a starting point? Mm-hmm. So the important thing also is that we measured all the children at the same time chronologically, and that was this fall. That means the PEG kids are just starting kindergarten. The kids who had PEG are just starting kindergarten. What is the control group are just starting PEG. So they haven't had any PEG exposure yet, and the other kids have had a full year of PEG exposure. That's who we're looking at. Okay, and so this is like all those other studies you've heard of, the Tulsa study, the Boston RD study, and I'll talk to you about another, Steve Barnett just did this same study in 8 states. So we're really have Tennessee has a study. We're now in the pantheon of RD studies. It's a good group to be with. It's a very fine group to be with, but we all share the same concerns. So we have 4 outcome measures. The PPVT, which is used by every single one of these RDs, by the way. It's a measure in common, which actually is nice in a way. You may not like the measure, but it is something in common. The Woodcock-Johnson letter word identification is our measure of early literacy. Woodcock-Johnson applied problems is our measure of early math skills. And we chose the Hearts and Flowers as our measure of children's executive function. And I'll talk to you a little bit about other measures that other people have used, and there's not a lot in common about what people chose, both because the construct is defined differently, what people really think we mean by executive function, and then when we thought we meant the same thing, we chose different measures, and none of these measures is normed. You understand, all these other measures, we know what the sort of expectation is for a national sample of children of exactly that same age. We don't know that for the executive function measure. So there's a lot that is a little shakier in our ability to make confident statements about that.
Just ask a quick question. In the fall 2017 assessment, you're assessing the treatment group.
Yes.
So the graduates from PEG.
Correct.
And then you're assessing the incoming PEG
Correct.
class. But you didn't assess the treatment group when they entered PEG?
We did for other reasons, because we're doing longitudinal growth studies, so those data, though, are not used in an RD. It's an interesting question, because we don't have the post-test for the incoming pay group. We don't have that nice design with a pre and a post on every child. They're actually sort of assuming that those kids are equivalent, and we can look at their demographic characteristics, which is like gender and number of children who are speak Spanish at home, and those are similar in the group. So you're trying to sort of establish this. It's like just to say, is this true that we can assume they're sort of the same kids? But you're right. We have those data for a different reason, and can use them for other analyses, but they are never used in an RD.
Okay.
Yep.
2 questions for you.
Sure.
One is, can you speak a little bit more about the ways in which the 2 groups are similar on other variables? And also, when you're making the comparison, are you in some way accounting for anticipated differences just based on developmental stage?
Yes. In fact, we're using measures that can be age adjusted, as you know, so that a score on the PPVT takes account of what your age is. However, when you do these analyses, regression discontinuity analysis, age in days is in every single model. And so if you put an age adjusted measure in, you're like double accounting for age. So we use like the W score or a age a score that can be looking across ages, but we don't use the age adjusted version of these scores because that over adjusts for age. They use a continuous score, like a score that could be looked at. It's just, for a 3 and a 4-year-old, and age is in every model. So that's how we account for age. It always is in the model, because we do know that there is a developmental trajectory in kids, that kids are going to get better on these measures at some level, even if you did nothing, if they're not kept in a closet somewhere.
That's accounted for.
That is correct. That is correct. But it is one of the worries about early childhood RDs versus other RDs, because we have development built into what's happening, and that is the tricky part of it. And if you were really dying to dig into this, people at Vanderbilt have written a lot about this. There's a lot of controversy just about that, about are we able to really take development out of it and ask about what the program and effect is above and beyond development. So they think you get close to it here, but there are still some concerns, particularly as that band gets wider and wider. Wouldn't be an issue at all if they were one day apart.
Right.
Yeah, no, you've got it. You're there. You can be at the conference. So we looked at their background characteristics, which was all we have, but we don't have a lot. And so when you look at percent female, percent from English home language, they're almost exactly the same, the two groups, which makes you feel a little better. And that's even true whether you cut them very close or leave them wide out. So it does say we haven't gotten a completely different group, but there's so many ways kids could differ that we don't know about. We cannot say to you they are exactly the same on every characteristic. Okay? Okay, and we're gonna stay on the next slide. Oh, is it the next slide? No, sorry. Okay, this one we wanted you to see. If you just looked at their age-adjusted scores, this is sort of what you're getting at. The group in the middle is the children who haven't had PEG. The group on the right is the children who do have PEG. Say it again. Performance of the impact study children pre and post PEG.
It's pre and post groups, not the children themselves.
Correct. It's not the same children.
Okay, yeah, these are not the same children. The ones in the middle are the children coming into PEG, the ones on the right are the children who've left PEG. And we're showing you just what you said. They do change over time. There is growth going on here, even age adjusted. And so it's just to show you, and I think the thing that we think this slide sort of illustrates is the kids coming into PEG, which is true of the kids who have leaving PEG, come in pretty low on vocabulary. That's going to be something we should keep in our minds when we look at the vocabulary effect. This is the conundrum, I think, in all of our early childhood programming. This is much harder to get an impact on than early literacy and early math, which are much, they're sort of more concrete skills that we can measure. Vocabulary is something that really comes from exposure. It comes from reading and talking. There's really just not other ways to get to it. And so this group, because they were chosen to be low income and not had a lot of connection with early childhood, it's not unexpected that they're coming in with sort of lower than average vocabulary skills.
Can you just explain what age adjusted means?
So if I have a population where I've taken this test and given it to a representative sample of 4-year-olds in the country, and I can slice them by month. So I could say I take all the 4.1 month kids and I look at the distribution of their score, and I can say where our child falls relative to what would be expected with a large group of representative 4-year-olds. So 86, 100 is the mean. We've
So you're not sort of adjusting the 4-year-old scores to be like the 5-year-old?
No, we are not,
adjusting it to be
absolutely
month
not.
by month sort of
That is
relation to
correct.
development.
But
Okay.
we can compare them because they've been adjusted to their
Got it.
own age relative distribution. It's a very powerful thing for us because even if you don't have a control group, it sort of tells you how am I doing relative to what I would like to think for every child, that they look like a normal 4-year-old. Okay, so this is really a setup for the slide that, let's see, this happens. I'm sorry, do you have a slide that has the numbers on it?
Okay.
Does your slide have the actual effect size?
Yeah, it's good.
It does.
I don't know what happens here. It happened on my computer. It didn't happen on Amy.
We've
So,
got it.
The next page shows the numbers.
okay, let's go to one. Right, but all right, I'm going to just show you the bars a minute. Now, I'll say the numbers, but I'm really sorry. This is a computer issue, oddly enough. So the top bar, as you can see on the bottom, is 0.92. Effect size, I'll go back to this, 0.92. The effect size on math is 0.45. The effect size on vocabulary is 0.21. The effect size on executive function is 0.05. The stars are correct. They tell you how statistically significant it is. How likely are we to have gotten that effect by chance? Very unlikely on early literacy and math, right? Less firm about vocabulary, and there was essentially no significant effect on executive function as we measured it. I want to stay on this slide a minute because let's celebrate this. You have a program run through community-based programs, which has really not happened before in this kind of study, where you tried to bring in the school district as support, and you tried to give those programs what we think are the characteristics and features, resources that have made the public school preschools so successful with children. And you've now taken a completely different delivery mechanism, community-based programs, and tried to bring those resources to them. And the question, we ask this question all the time, can you get the same effect when you've changed the context? Often the answer is no, because there was something very particular about the context. They're in schools, the teachers are different than in community-based programs. And I would say many of the teachers in PEG were not different teachers than they were in the regular community-based programs. They moved over. They were asked to move over. They moved some of their good teachers, just some teachers willing to move out of their regular classroom. So we're really dealing with a different world here. And when you look at the 8-state study that Steve Barnett just did, the average impacts were 1.0 effect size on early literacy, 0.40 on math, 0.25 on vocabulary. Public school preschool, and they're all public school preschool programs. So we are right with them. Sorry, I was blind, my blinder didn't come off there. So I think you have to say this has been a successful experiment in moving high-quality early childhood into community-based programs. And this study will make a splash for that reason. I don't think we knew this. This was actually not a given. And I think over time, I think both Jocelyn and Sarah would tell you, it took a while to get these programs to take up these resources in a kind of consistent, homogeneous, clear way, because you're asking them to change their practices in some ways. You're asking them to get coaching in a different way than they have before. You're asking them to really focus in on some of the curricula in a different way than you have before. So I don't think it was like you snap your finger and you apply, you just hand people resources, it's going to be the same. I think it took some work, but.
And these data are based on basically 2 years of implementation, which is actually pretty amazing. I think there remain some challenges and improvements to be made in terms of implementation, which actually would make you even more hopeful in some ways. So I do think it's worth noting that this is fairly early on, actually, in terms of the program implementation.
So I was struck by a slide earlier that, I forget exactly everything that was on the slide, but it was that line slide. And
with the kids.
No.
The class.
No,
class
and it
scores.
was instructional
Oh,
practice.
yeah, the class scores,
And
right.
there was some that was like a 1, and then I think the average was 3.5.
There you go.
Right. So if I look at, and obviously that's a little concerning, instructional support, because we
Absolutely.
think of that as really one of the critical keys to getting what we just looked at on this other
Right.
slide. So if you can flip back to the other one, I
Right.
guess, because that's not as much my world, but I'm trying to figure out, so if the instructional support piece, or whatever that term was on the last slide, that I've already forgotten, was sort of such a range, where does that tell us,
Yeah. We're going to
how
get
did
to.
we do so well when that looks so not well?
Let me show, you're gonna feel better when we start looking at the variation, but this is the average, remember? There could be some programs that got bigger effects than this, some programs that got smaller effects, and so you don't see in here the variation in impact. We'll get to that. This is one overall impact, just on average across all the programs.
But that
But the other
instruction,
thing,
I'm sorry.
sorry, go ahead,
No,
Mary.
that instructional piece crosses over every single one of these characteristics,
That is correct. That is correct.
Go on, Jim.
But one thing you have in that instructional support scale that you can see playing out here
Yes.
is cognitive press.
That is
Right?
correct.
So you have like what's the cognitive rigor of the curriculum, which is going to show up in vocabulary and executive functioning, in part because you can't really do really high quality curriculum delivery without affecting vocabulary and EF, but it's the hardest to do. So I think that's where those two relate, which is you can get to the letters and some of the numbers work that's more rote and discrete.
Right.
And not be high on instructional support because your cognitive press is going to be low.
That's right. That's
which,
right.
Which does, so we want to celebrate, and then we want to ask ourselves, are we trending towards higher quality curriculum work over
Right.
time? Is it going to take 3 years? Like, what's the accumulation? Because this is not going to get us to the promise that's
no, that is
been
the
made,
problem,
right?
right.
So that's the rub, and I'm celebratory and sober at the same time. Right?
Well, that's good. I think you tell your
At
your
my
teenage children to do
cocktail
that too,
party
right?
about the RD.
Yeah. Sure.
I was just struck with the executive function row.
Yes.
Are these standard scores, their standard scores are not T-scores? The 50
They're not
is
even
really
standard scores, they're actually raw scores. They're sort of a count of, or percent, correct.
and flow.
That's all we have. We don't have an
Okay.
age standardized score for any of the executive function measures. That's what I'm saying. It's a little harder to interpret.
It's hard to look at this then with the others because
It's
harder
true.
to
Sometimes we
notice.
took it off and put it
Yeah.
on a separate
Yeah.
chart.
Okay.
Because it's really, the scoring.
So I was
but-
looking at like, what
Right,
happened to
remember,
them
this
before
is
they
an
came in?
effect size, so
Yeah.
it's not based on the metric, it's saying, whatever the metric is, we were not able to show a big difference between the kids who had PEG and the kids who didn't have PEG.
Sure.
It's just small, yes.
My question, your comment about the positive effects being related to relationship and influences of the public school. Did you actually measure what those influences were, and is there any way to evaluate?
Did it matter that they were partners in this? Did they create some? It's an
Before we
interesting
jump to
question.
that
Amy
conclusion.
has thought about this too. We talked about this a little.
Well, I mean, I think they, in terms of measure, right, so they certainly employed and trained the coaches that actually provided coaching in the programs. They helped, Jocelyn could speak more to this, they certainly helped to coordinate the professional development that happened in terms of measurement, like in terms of the perception. I mean, we are continuing to look at the collaboration and the extent to which this is changing over time and sort of what the nature of those connections were. But
There just seems
yeah.
such a lack of that everywhere, that
Yeah.
connection, and
Yeah.
it'd be great
Nice to be able to
to
quantify
capture
it
that,
some way.
yeah.
to be able to
Yeah, and we've been
use it to influence more
absolutely,
alignment.
absolutely. No, it's a good. You want to say more? No.
This is so exciting. We haven't even gone to the exploratory findings. We have a lot of good questions. Yes.
A comment and a question.
Yes.
I want to really highlight what you started with, which is the idea that this is actually very significant from a policy standpoint. This was sort of the challenge in front of us from the inception of the agency. Could we take the pre-existing delivery structures available in Massachusetts, the existing infrastructure, and leverage that to produce high-quality, meaningful outcomes for kids? And this is the first time that we have an affirmative answer to that question. And the fact that we are doing it as well, if not better, than the nation's most rigorously evaluated, respected, and long-standing programs across the country is very significant. And so, thank you for all the hard work that went into this, and to everyone who has, played a role in helping to make this happen. My question is, in the context of looking at the effect sizes, particularly relative to early literacy, early math, and vocabulary, based on your knowledge of other facets of the early childhood literature, are these important in terms of long-term measures and sort of long-term anticipated positive outcomes for kids?
I'd love to talk about that. Do you mind if we put it in the discussion part? And no, I really mean, I have, Amy saw me and Jocelyn, I have a whole page at the end where I just went on about this. Because I've gone and looked, but it is the critical question in the end for all of us. But let me lay out some of the other findings for you, because maybe it will also begin to get you thinking about how we might think as a state beyond just this overall effect.
Sorry, can I just, before we move on, I don't mean to throw cold water on that incredibly compelling statement.
Somebody should have written that down.
But I think at least as I'm hearing the sort of hypothesis that's being tested, it's that there are outcomes like this that we are seeing in essentially public school preschool programs. And what we're testing is whether those same outcomes can be derived in a private setting. And I guess my question is, especially looking at some of the providers here, Community Day, for example, being one of them, they're not necessarily slouches either.
No,
I wonder whether some of the outcomes we're getting here, we might have seen in those private providers, whether they were in PEG or not. And I know that there's more analysis that goes into this, but and it's not all of them. So there's undoubtedly there's variation among the private providers. But my question is, are we sort of dealing with a pre-selected subset of private providers that are likely to get us more likely to get us results like this? And as we broaden the pool, then we're going to start to see the effects watered down.
I think you're probably right. I think as, I think we're always torn about whether to ask what's the best case scenario and then what's the average scenario, and you sort of want to ask the best case scenario first. Is it even possible? And then, as you're right, the next step would be, what would happen if we had randomly picked providers out of these communities, just randomly out of a hat, and asked them to do...
Or what if we had just done this with these providers without the PEG program design?
What were their effects, right? Yeah.
Just in broader context, that's a great question, and that's in part what QRIS is focused on, encouraging, right? Is to move in this direction and to ensure high quality with or without the partnership with the public schools. All of these, one of the earlier slides, they were pre-selected in that they had to either be already at QRIS level 4 or NAEYC plus QRIS level 3 by the end of the grant. Many of the providers in the mix were of higher quality. There was some variation, some of which probably shows up. But yes, I mean, these are folks on the private side of the equation who are already doing high quality work.
And I think we have to acknowledge that in our interpretation of the findings. This is not the last time we should ask this question, but I would think we probably could say among ourselves that to move a broader and less experienced or less well implementing group of providers to this level is just going to take more resources. It would require it would require more resources, it would require deeper investments in the staff and the program, and I'm not sure that's the direction this field is going to go, but I do think it's worth acknowledging that this is not a random sample of community-based programs. And you're, as people say, you're in Massachusetts, Barb. Those providers are already ahead of providers in the rest of the country. So we're going to have to fight that a little bit anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think our implementation our implementation data do show that these programs still, again, have their own challenges as well. And so I think the point is definitely well taken in terms of, I think these agencies were identified because they were perceived to be sort of ready to implement something like this. But I would say in terms of all the implementation data, as you just saw a small part of it, there is a very large range, and actually like some of the supports that are being able to be put in place for teachers, for example.
So in that sense, thinking about contributions, the dosage data is presumably going to be very revealing. In other words, what would be helpful, right, over time is to look at dosage as treated, right? And the other data that's going to be really critical is this professional learning data, right? So what was the right strategy? Rather than a saturation and,
just
bundle it and do all this, like can we lift up for the rest of the state and or states what the best strategy was by baseline? So you've got this range, and presumably the coaching has certain effects in some kinds of places, and the PLCs and so in my view, like that's where this becomes really critical, right?
And we will get to those data. I want to say one thing about this. Remember I told you we tested this on the narrower band? The effects in early literacy and math, very stable, very robust. Even when we narrowed the kids down, even if it's a smaller sample, the vocabulary finding was a little more sensitive to a smaller sample, but mostly in significance, not in the direction and size of the effect. So I can find the same effect and it's not significant in a smaller sample. So the effect sort of stands, but what goes away is the significance. So that's really important for us to know, and it's really important. You should be asking me this question every time. Well, what happens, Barb? Is this stable? Is this consistent? Because I've told you that's what we worry about. So I want to say we have confidence in these. These are pretty stable. They're not sensitive to different ways of modeling it. And we're not going to spend a lot more time on this, except the one thing we haven't brought up, which is not about the program delivery system, about the children. The children in this study, on average, or consistently, are low income. Not just in Boston, Boston and Peg both have about 40% of the kids from homes where English is not the first language. It is lower than that in Tulsa and Tennessee. We have a population of kids that are also more at risk. And that's not something that is, that's important to know, that you managed to do this with kids who had mostly in 4 of the sites, no access to early childhood, which is also a proxy for not being highly connected to the whole social services system. These families were hard to find. They had to go out and sort of find the ones because they didn't think that early childhood was something they were looking for. So I think not only do we have to understand the delivery mechanism, we understand the samples. And the sample in PEG of all these samples was probably the most at risk on multiple indicators. We don't know a lot. Tennessee was the other program that had an age cutoff. Both Tulsa and Boston, there were also kids in those programs that were not low income.
Well, Boston was only 60%
Right, so
low
it's
income
it's
in
a
that
less
RD,
at-risk
so
sample, definitely.
That's where you get the vocab, you see that difference in
Yes,
vocab.
totally.
You have a totally different baseline.
Right. Does that make sense? Did we go right by that too fast? Do you want to say it again, or that's okay?
Was the 60% at or below 100% of federal poverty level, or 200% federal poverty level?
They had to be
For Boston.
200%
To be in.
to be in, but we found that they were, a good number of them were below 100% of poverty. So they were poorer than they needed to be by eligibility, and that is not true on average for Boston and
Well-
Tulsa, but it is true for Tennessee. It's kind of a mixed
And I think
bag.
it's a little confusing because the Boston RD here is not PEG, that's a prior study.
Yeah.
So Boston was also in the community-based setting part of PEG, but this is the public school preschool Boston RD that is on this slide. So just, it's a little confusing.
I think I just want to add a comment harking back to the conversation we had on the previous slide. And following up on something that Noni had said, I think if we look forward, we sort of take a forward-looking perspective, I think we want to pay attention to that vocabulary effect size. And continuing to think about how can we move programs further along in vocabulary. And to the question about the role of the public school, I think sort of having lived this with the program, I would say it isn't as much about what the public school brought to the table as it was about the fact that you had a group of people coming together from multiple agencies, including the public school, with a very unique perspective, talking about how best to support the teachers. And we've heard anecdotally from some of the community-based programs saying they have never taken their teachers as seriously as they've had in the PEG program, and they really appreciated the opportunity to do that. So I do think that, while it's hard to translate that into evidence here, it's important to bear in mind that that's a platform by which there is an opportunity to think about continuing improvement in these programs. And we did see some increases in the class scores from year 1 to year 2. So that, there's some evidence of growth, not in the instructional support score, but I think that it's an important piece to keep in mind.
And probably more focus on evidence and goal setting, I think,
Yeah,
because of that.
Yeah, and including some of the evidence we brought to the table. I mean, having the data was helpful as well in shifting the conversation.
And the question we don't know the answer to is, what's the purchase on a 0.2 effect size in vocabulary over time? In other words, what does that boost mean for taking up later learning? And that's the real value.
Right, if you go back to this slide, our main analyst, who I really was going to call them out at the beginning, Carrie Hofer, who's worked on the Tennessee RD, and Austin Nichols is a senior economist, they translated these into sort of percentile improvements. And so when you're talking, and people sort of understand percentiles, and so the kind of effect you get in early literacy is about a 30% percentile growth. That's a fairly major change. Whereas before you might have been, if these children were at the 50th percentile, then they would be 30 percentile points higher compared to other kids. So when you get down to vocabulary, you're talking about something like a 7 percentile change. It's not gigantic, and it's not enough, as you know, Noni. I don't think it would be enough when they hit kindergarten to let them continue to take advantage of all of the opportunities to grow. We've seen this. This is the thing the whole field worries about. It was the major conclusion out of Steve Barnett. Something we're not doing. And the trouble is, if it's a lot of it is exposure and time, you can't compress that into an early childhood year. You can't compress 3 years of less exposure to vocabulary and concepts and semantic networks and places to put information when you get new information. It's really hard to imagine making that up in a year. It's just, we're sort of too late in a way. I think it would really push you to look younger in a way. I think that it's just hard. But
It also just pushes on, we don't need to get into this, but it really pushes on the curriculum piece. And I'm not suggesting that it's easy to just drop down a curriculum, but the instructional support is getting at just what is happening in terms of formal
language
learning
interaction.
opportunities day in and day out, as opposed to this is our 20 minutes on our letters and this is our 20, right? So that's, and that's the transcending that the QRS needs to figure out how to capture, right? Is how do you move from these more discrete moments to a really
sort of
high
continuous
cognitive
language
press.
responsivity,
Exactly.
the sort of back and forth.
Yeah.
But I think also that's one of the things that EEC can learn is that we're not just concerned with the 1 year of preschool. We're really looking at birth, studying at birth, and looking at the caring adults around that child. So it will tell us a lot, in terms of how we can impact our initiatives.
Right. And I think that, what we can see as kind of the story that's been told by PEG is, at the beginning of this program, many teachers were taking on a new curriculum, and it took, well over a year for them to kind of master what that meant to implement the curriculum as it stood. And the real challenge has come with how to implement that in a way that is meaningful and really integrates the types of instruction that we would like to see that's beneficial for children. And that's, the biggest challenge, but I think also, where we've seen so much support coming on behalf of coaching and other professional learning opportunities, the attention to the integration of those two things is very time intensive and requires a lot of focus, but that's certainly the direction they've been going.
Noni, I don't want to tell tales outside of school, but Noni and I have a relationship on another study where we're looking outside of the PEG programs. And the interesting is we train people to do a very elaborate language observation. Write down who's talking to whom, what are they saying, what's the cognitive press. And it was very hard to train people to reliability. And the kind of sad thing is you send them out into the world and they come back and they say,
there's no variation.
Nothing happened. I never saw a conversation for most of the kids, anything other than a sort of passing, good job, hello.
Directives.
And so we know that out in the world on average, as Noni says, this is our challenge, to really push the kind of language responsivity, cognitive press that's going to build those things. So this is why it's fun to talk with this group, and I'm sorry, we're just going to move right on here. So now we're going to get into the part you really would like to know, but notice I put at the top exploratory. This is where we're all, holding hands and signing a pact that we understand we can't make a lot out of any single finding here, although it's very tempting. And so I'll give you the overview right now, is we looked at a selected set of classroom features and weren't able to see a lot of differentiation of effects by different classroom features. But it's just a beginning there, so we'll get to what we're going to do next. So I would say right now we have not been able to do much informing out of this study about which kinds of quality features are making a difference in the variation and impacts. We also looked at whether it mattered what kind of children were in the programs, and there we see some more stronger suggestive effects, and that is that PEG had a particularly strong impact on the children who were more at risk. The children from homes where English was not the primary language, and children particularly without any prior formal childcare. And we'll show you some data on that, but it's actually pretty fascinating. You might have said, well, I expected that, they came in lower, they're going to do better. But I think this is actually a positive for this finding, that they were actually able to move children who came in potentially without a lot of base on which to build some of these skills, and they managed in a year, 1 year. And they're already 4 when they start to get some change. We also looked, because of PEG, at differences by community, just to help the policy questions about the way the program differs across community. Those are less, the idea of a community effect is less of interest nationally, but it really is what's going on there that makes a difference that might have some importance to the larger field.
Sorry if I missed this, but did you look at the public versus the private provider?
No.
Variation?
No. I think everyone here we don't have any private.
No, they're all private.
I mean, we don't have any public school pre-K, we don't have any, we have Head Start. It's Head Start and community-based providers, right, so we don't have a third
Right.
group, right?
Okay.
So I'm gonna, there, maybe it's better that way, we didn't know they had animation. We'd been more excited if these had flown in. But this first one is looking, the two bars represent the children for whom English is the home language, and that is the darker bar, and the children who come from a home where English is not the home language, that's the lighter gray bar. And the numbers at the end are the effect size for that subgroup of children. So you can see on early literacy, there was a substantially bigger impact, and the reason they have a red bar on them is that the difference in the effect size is significant. 1.19 is significantly different than 0.71. So that's pretty impressive, but it says that average, remember the overall average is 0.9, that's because it's the average across all these types of children. If we knew how to split the sample in ways that told us important things, but these are the variables we had. So it does tell you that the children who came in who probably needed the most support in their early literacy skills and even on vocabulary, that was significant too. Look at the size of the impact on vocabulary for the kids who came in probably lacking English vocabulary. And this is a measure of English vocabulary skills. Remember that. So that's why you see that 0.41. They really did PEG did really actually make a difference to those kids. So does that make sense to you? Now, then we looked, I just want you to know, we looked at these same impacts in a narrower band sample because it's important to know whether these hold up. And the effects on early literacy and early math held up. They were still significant when we had a narrower, more homogeneous on either side, kids who were tighter. The vocabulary finding dropped down in significance, but the difference, the effect sizes were about the same. It's just they don't have enough kids anymore to find statistical significance. So this is actually more robust than we thought it was going to be.
I think the wonderful thing about that is the kids can learn, they're capable.
Absolutely, and these programs are doing it. They're making a difference. But what we know is when you come in, on average, a whole standard deviation, 15 points lower than the average child at that age, even a change of 0.41. 0.41 indicates about less than 7 points. So you're not getting them up to normal, but if this continued every year, we would be great. But what we know, and what Greg Duncan tells us, is we worry because they get to kindergarten and this does not necessarily continue. It's not that kindergarten then builds on this and they continue to overachieve relative to other kids. We continue to keep feeding them so that they begin to look like other kids by the time they're in third grade. I actually looked at, I've shown this to Naomi and to Jocelyn, when somebody looked at the ECLSK data, and when the kids who came in low on vocabulary never caught up. They never catch up with the kids who start out high on vocabulary. I can catch you up on your letter knowledge, I can catch you up on your number knowledge, but I can't catch you up on vocabulary. That is really hard to do. Yeah, so I deserve, yeah.
So we keep holding up that our sort of true north is the public school system and their pre-K, which I'm not sure I agree
You don't
with
have
that,
to,
frankly.
you don't have to, it's just the
Because
one we
in
know
the
the most
community
about
like
right now.
Springfield, as an example, it might be a great program, but it's 2.5 hours a day, so you gotta.
It's not
I mean,
enough, it's not enough for these kids,
I
right.
think it's public pre-K nationally has been studied more
Yeah.
robustly than in
Okay.
Massachusetts.
Okay.
I think that's why
Right.
that's a
But I was
reference
struck a
point.
minute ago when you said, we're not sure that it continues in kindergarten. So on the one hand, we're saying we think public pre-K is more robust and has better outcomes, and yet we're just saying now that, and we designed this program somewhat with public pre-K in mind, longer, the
Yep,
teacher
yep,
pay, teacher qualifications, support, coaching. And then we go to kindergarten where we have those same qualifications, but we're yet saying that we don't think it's being sustained. So I'm really
Well,
confused.
I think that the reason that we thought of public pre-K, teachers are paid better. They often, for a long time, were the teachers that were more likely to have master's degrees in.
As is the case for kindergarten, though, and I'm confused
But
by.
I think that has to do with programming. You can talk to the people in the school districts. They felt they have not spent enough time on their very youngest elementary school programs. They aren't picking up the ball there. And so I think it's another challenge for school districts. We've done our part. We've done our part with early childhood. Now they got to pick it up and go, right?
Yeah, and just
I always
anecdotally,
say that, right?
we've talked a little bit about this with the PEG programs. I think there's probably an opportunity to have more conversation and push harder on this issue. But kindergarten teachers in these communities are dealing with children that come in with a really wide range of scores. These are kids that in many cases don't have any prior early education experience. So it's a challenge for a teacher to think about, what do you do with these kids that are coming in looking okay versus these kids that are really struggling? And there's a tendency that's very human to focus on the kids that are struggling and let the kids that are kind of doing okay to go along. So that's another hypothesis for why you might not see the sustained growth in kindergarten for kids that are coming in having had a bump in pre-K.
Just think of the public school as a proxy for the quality features we care about, not the delivery mechanism. And it used to be sort of conflated with the delivery mechanism. You know, the teachers may be better trained, maybe they got paid better, maybe they were more professionally treated. And now that's starting to, but that doesn't necessarily mean that when you hit kindergarten, the same quality differences are happening. So it's a really good point, but more from the point of view of the school districts right now than the early childhood programs. So we're going to put that aside right now because we can't take on the whole world today, right? We'd be happy to if they gave us, control, but nobody's, yes.
And I think the public school pre-K, that's typically the mechanism by which other states implemented pre-K at scale.
That's correct.
And so that's where most of the other studies of pre-K effects have come out of. So I'm not sure that we're necessarily saying that that public school pre-K is better. I think what we're saying is that other folks who have done it at scale have done it through the public school system, and there are certain research-based characteristics that we've been trying to translate into a more mixed delivery system. And the question was, can we do that successfully?
Right.
So
Nicely put. Thank you. Write that down.
All right, so I am a
Okay,
little
so we have
mindful
one
of the
more
time.
little
Thanks.
table here and this is, again, something that no other study actually knew. We know something they don't know because we collected these data because it was part of the eligibility criteria. We don't know whether this finding would have stood up in other states or other studies. So we have to say we're kind of in our own world here. And so what it says is that the children who had no prior care also had a bigger effect. There's a bigger effect on those children than the children who came in with prior care. And I don't want you to be alarmed by the bars going to the left here. Essentially, those are saying there's very little effect on those kids. They're not essentially different than zero. They're just, it's again, just because we have a lot of variability in the data. But what that solid red bar says for early math, that the difference in the effect is significant. That 0.6, is it 8 from here? Yeah. Sorry, 0.68 is significantly different than basically zero, which is what happened. So a lot of the effect we're seeing is because you have kids coming in who've had no other preschool experience. So we're getting, and I think that's important to know, and we don't know, again, to the extent that this is true. The others are dotted because they weren't highly significant. They were significant at 0.10, which is not often thought of as really significant in the statistical phrase. And when you looked at this in the narrow band sample, what was once significant at a 0.10 level disappears. Only the math effect really is stable here. So moving on. Okay, so now then we looked here. This is the last thing we're going to let you chew on, which are the community differences. And again, now we're dividing the sample into really small parts, right? So we have to be very careful here. But I think if you sort of squint your eyes, 3 of the communities look pretty similar. One looks similar in pattern, but the bars are shorter. And then one looks really much more variable in terms of the way it affected the outcomes. So I think there were overall, if you just do a test of whether community makes a difference, it says yes. And then you would have to go back and test every community against each other. But when you again do this test when you've narrowed the bandwidth, most of that community effect starts to fade. It's really, it's underpowered. We don't have a way to test it. So, you can, I know there's a lot of temptation to understand why these communities would be different. And does it tell us, I'm now passing it to Amy, who's going to have to lead the rest of the discussion about sort of, aren't you? Okay.
All right, sorry, not to get yeah, just what Barbara just said is that we know there is gonna continue to be real interest in evidence from this study in terms of the programmatic inputs and which ones are highest leverage in terms of their effects on kids. So EEC can use the findings from this evaluation to guide decisions about other just workforce support, program quality, all of that. And so we're going to be continuing to explore classroom characteristics that might be related to impacts within this RD design framework, and have some thoughts, as Noni said, to do some threshold analyses where we may establish thresholds for high and low intensity of different features as one part of our examination, potentially looking at sort of classroom composites of different features and how they're coming together within each classroom. We could do that at the community level as well. We have additional data from teachers about their perceptions about, what they're teaching, what's developmentally appropriate, what strategies to use. So we have a lot of data to use to continue to explore sort of at a less rigorous, but I know of great interest level moving forward, and so happy to talk more about that. We know that we're going to complete our analysis of, we have a cost study going on as well, which this is just more in terms of the larger evaluation and what we're going to be focusing on in the near term. We have parent survey data, which we will be analyzing just to understand that side of things in terms of evidence of changes in parents related to their PEG experience. And we actually recently just got access to data from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education for kindergarten, obviously limited data that's available there, but to start to try to track some of these kids over time. And we're actually talking also with EEC about to what extent we want to even gather some additional data over time on kids to really understand what's happening better in early elementary school. So I think what I want to leave you with is that this analysis in terms of some of the exploratory analysis is not over. We'd love to get input on other things that we haven't talked about, and we'll also be looking at we'll be looking at the effects of PEG and what we can learn from it in different ways beyond just this piece of it. So I know that was a lot, all in all.
Whoa, you guys were a very good audience. You stuck right with us there.
But any questions or parting thoughts, or we're happy to follow up or come back at some point, whatever's helpful.
I see in the appendix that you gave us that you do have data on the teachers, on the teacher qualifications and the percentage that have you done any analysis to compare teachers, like what happens in classrooms with teachers with master's degrees in early childhood versus teachers with bachelor's degrees with 1 year of experience?
We're going to do more. Right now, because all the teachers had BAs, basically the number who had masters were a small slice. So we have not spent a lot. Those are some of the characteristics we haven't had time to look at. I think what the field would tell you now is the direct effect of that. That direct effect of that on children is really the model's going to go through quality in a way. It's unlikely you're going to find a direct effect, but what we really want to know is how does that affect the quality, because we know the quality has not a gigantic, but it has a consistent effect, and so that's what we're going to have to start to understand. How does having different kinds of supports and types of teachers affect quality? I don't think we're likely to find large direct effects of just that versus the impact, but you're exactly on target. I think that's what we're going to keep looking at. We have a lot of data. And we actually focused on some of the more salient data now, and if you hadn't had an impact, this whole thing would have ground to a halt pretty fast. So we're lucky to have data that actually might give us some clues about the way you would allocate resources, the way you would hire. So any of that is fair game, and Jocelyn, our leader, is going to help guide us in what are analyses that seem reasonable and useful to the EEC. And then we always, we're the people that say, no, you can't do that, or no, there's no power there, or no, let's not, that's scary, So it's a good teaming.
Yes. This is an enormous amount of work, so first of all, thank you. And I'm thinking a little bit more about the Secretary's question, and I'm wondering, as you think about future evaluations plans, is there data in the validation study that where they did take a look at associated child outcomes? Could it be cut in a way that would allow us to drive closer to an answer to the question that the Secretary posed in terms of being able to compare between highly rated programs in the private sector without a mixed delivery partnership versus those in the PEG program that do have it?
Yeah, yes, and I'm glad you brought that up because another, yes, we can find out, I guess, if that is possible and if that's something that would, that would actually help inform.
Do we have access to the data that would allow us to do some secondary analysis?
Absolutely. We've also, haven't made any decisions about this, but I've been talking about opportunities to collect some more data on non-PEG classrooms in maybe some of these same ELPs, the communities, in terms of sort of what's going on there and what those look like. And again, not as part of the RD, but to help understand what would have happened
in the absence of
what
PEG.
does happen otherwise. Right. Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up.
Although I think the one cautionary note to highlight is that we won't have effect sizes to compare. Sure. It's just important to recognize that. There's a lot that's descriptive that we can look at.
All right, last question, Joni. Go ahead. All you, Joni.
So I guess I'm going back to my first comment in terms of, so what are we going to do with this now? Some of the things, I'm taking notes on one side about this is what this means and this is what the study means. One of the things I'm thinking about was executive functioning. We don't know what's going on.
Right.
Does that tell us that we need to more robustly incorporate the social emotional curriculum into things? That's an example. I don't know where we were on family engagement.
Right.
What happened with that? What about the instructional practices that worked or did not work, and how does that affect not your work, but the other work of the department with professional development, GPS, coaching and mentoring and all that?
Right.
And I'm always concerned about kids on IEPs. We had a very small percentage.
Right, and they're,
And from what I understood from the beginning, the public school serviced the kids' IEPs.
That tends to be true.
So that also, what that's doing now is our inclusive classrooms are now in the public school. Many of them, those classrooms aren't taking these high-risk kids, the kids who are dual language learners, particularly. So what does that tell us, and more rhetorically, about composition of programs and where we place some of our efforts? I guess I'm interested in taking some of these findings and saying what else can we do with them, as well as what you're talking about is digging deeper.
Right. I understand what you're saying. What can we, if it stopped here, what can we take from it?
Right.
I just want to comment quickly on the social emotional one. I think there's a large summary of the evidence from preschool, and one of their conclusions is unless programs actually explicitly focus on the building of social emotional skills, it's rare to find a big impact on it. In other words, it doesn't happen just sort of because it's a good program. Where they're seeing the effects are in programs that actually have a social emotional skill building curriculum or focus or activities. And so I do think that, there's a lot to think about here, not just from this study, but how it mirrors the larger national discussion.
And some of us participated in a conference that EEC and ESC had last week about trauma-informed practices and all. And clearly we're getting to that point that we have to be intentional about this. And
Correct.
We have to be incorporated.
Correct.
Great, Jocelyn, last comment.
Oh no, the pressure. I think on the social, actually it's a good place to stop. On the social emotional side, we do also have teacher rating of child social skills and behavior pre-post. You can't use it in the RD because of the nature of the data. And there's a similar story there in that the kids are largely doing okay, and they largely go in doing okay and come out doing okay. We're not really seeing growth on a standard scale within that population. And I do think that in the early childhood field in general, there is an assumption that the social skills are really important. It is one of the primary drivers of everything that teachers do. and that implementing a developmentally appropriate curriculum will inherently support the development of those skills. And I think your point is really important, that as we think about curriculum in these programs, thinking about the extent to which the curriculum in an integrated way is supporting both the children's social development as well as cognitive development will both make it more palatable to teachers, but also might actually put us in a place where we're achieving greater effects in an area that we do feel is really important.
Particularly on the transition to kindergarten.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. All right, we'll move next to our CCDF update on the state plan.
It's going to be a hard act to follow. I'm sorry, you know. No. Take them all. I've already eaten 4.
We're going to town on these today.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Lasso, Secretary Pizer, members of the board. Thank you for allowing me to present here today. So for those of you that don't know, my name is Tom Myers. I'm one of the Assistant General Counsels here. So I'm going to walk you through the Child Care Development Fund State Plan for federal fiscal year 2019 through 2021. I just want to note before we get started that similar to what we've done with regulations in the past, this will be sort of the first part of a 3-part series where we will have a discussion and overview of the state plan today. We'll come back here to potentially vote for releasing it for a public comment, and then ultimately coming back for a third time to do a final vote. So I'll walk you through the agenda here. I'll give you a very brief overview of the Child Care Development Block Grant. I know you've had extensive information through the board on this, so I'll give a very brief overview of CCDBG and the Child Care Development Fund. Then we will get into the summary of activities that EEC has completed in developing the CCDF state plan. And then I will go through a brief timeline for development of that plan. I want to show you a brief comparison of the 2016-2018 state plan next to the 2019-2021 state plan to just give a little bit of context. And then we'll walk into the meat and bones of this and go through the major changes of the state plan. So again, CCDBG, as you already know, is the block grant that was reauthorized in 2014, made significant changes to how child care is implemented in the state. The major goals here is to promote self-sufficiency for low-income families and support the healthy development and school readiness needs of children. Really consumer education, as well as delivering high-quality coordinated child care. Also to implement high-quality care that focuses on licensing standard and health and safety, improved health and safety standards. So we also want to, under this goal, is to increase the number of children in high-quality care settings. So just a brief overview of some of the goals here. Now to get into the summary of activities that we've completed so far with the state plan. So just to note here briefly, we did receive the first draft of the state plan from our federal partners in December. We are still currently working off a draft plan. They haven't released the final version, so that had gone through a public comment period, and they're in the process of revising that. So we expect to get the final draft sometime in April, early May. So they don't anticipate too many major changes, so we're still working off the draft plan right now. As far as what EEC has done, we've distributed the state plan to subject matter experts here in the agency, and they've been completing their sections of the state plan. Now, as part of some of the requirements with collaboration, there is a requirement that we collaborate with the tribal organizations here in the state. So we did reach out to the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead out of Martha's Vineyard, and we actually had a meeting with them back in February, a very productive meeting. So we're actually looking to establish a process where we can continue to meet with them, and maybe on a quarterly basis. We're still kind of working through a proposal so that we can have some information sharing, going through some training and all of that, so we can really stay focused with our partners there in the tribal community. We also reached out to the Mashpee tribe, the Wampanoag Mashpee tribe, and we did receive feedback from them that they are interested in meeting with us. So we're still in the process of trying to set up that first meeting. And we're actually hoping to develop a similar process where we will, similar proposal where we'll meet with them on a regular basis for information sharing, training purposes. So just a brief timeline here, just to show where we are. So the first draft of the plan we did complete here in the agency back on March 15th. And here we are presenting the first part of it to the board on April 10th. Now, we are planning on presenting as part of the requirement of the state plan to the advisory council. Now, originally this was scheduled for back in March, but unfortunately with some of the weather that we had to postpone that. So we are looking at April 27th. So we're hoping to have that meeting, incorporate that feedback and comment into the next board meeting that we present here the next time. So we're hoping to present again here for the board in May to release that for a public comment, and then hold a public hearing here in the Commonwealth to elicit feedback from the public. Ultimately, we hope to come back before the board in June to do a final vote, and the plan should be effective as of July 1st, 2018. So I just wanted to put this slide up here. I'm not going to go through each of these categories, but I just wanted to show the comparison between the 2016 and the 2018 plan versus the current plan. So there's 8 categories that we'll be working with, and they all remain the same. The major change here, as you can see at the bottom, is that the total number of questions is substantially higher. So we had 130 questions that we were working with in the prior plan, and now we're working with 161. So there's a lot of new categories that were incorporated into this new plan. So now we'll get into a little bit of the major criteria here, and I just wanted to put this slide up here just to show what we'll go through as far as each category. So this is really going to be sort of a high-level overview of some of the major changes within the CCDF plan, or some of the major topics. So we won't go through everything that's addressed in that plan, just because we'd be here for quite some time. So I'll address the major changes or major topics. I'll also talk about EEC's planned response to those major changes. Now, you will see asterisks in these in the EEC response section. So a green asterisk will denote something that is similar or substantially the same to the prior year's plan. And then something in red will designate something that is completely different or a new question. So the first section is the CCDF leadership and coordination piece. So under the CCDF state plan, we do need to consult with a number of agencies in development of the plan. So the appropriate representatives of general purpose and local government. So the board here satisfies that requirement, and we've used that in the past. So with presenting here today and then coming back as far as the public comment, that will satisfy that requirement. We're also required to meet with the State Advisory Council, and as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we'll be meeting with them in April to elicit feedback from that community. Those are both things that were required in the prior plan. The one new development here is that the coordination with the tribal organizations is now required. It was something that was recommended in the prior plans, but now it is a requirement, so we are engaging with those tribal communities, as I mentioned. And then this slide designates the other agencies that we will need to coordinate with in order to expand accessibility and continuity of care for program recipients. Now, this is a large list of programs. The great thing about with EEC is that a lot of these programs are actually incorporated within EEC already. So a lot of states have their licensing, their subsidy management agencies, their workforce development within separate agencies. Fortunately, EEC has it all in one, so we satisfy a lot of these requirements right off the bat. We also work with our agency responsible for the TANF distribution, DTA. We have monthly meetings with them. We also work with the agency responsible for child welfare, the Child Welfare Agency, Department of Children and Families. So we have monthly meetings both with those agencies as well as the CCR&R. So we are in the process of, we've already consulted with, or in the process with consulting with each of these agencies. So we're well on our way to meet this mandate. So then I'll go into section 2 of the state plan. So the highlight here, and this is to promote family engagement through outreach and consumer education. So one of the major pieces in the family engagement is to outreach with families with limited English proficiency and persons with disabilities. So one new thing here that we're doing is we're partnering with WIDA to offer online training modules for early educators. And WIDA, for any of you that don't know, is a national organization that advances academic language development and achievement for children and youth. So we are partnering with them to provide this service. Similar to prior years, we do have a telephonic translation service that EEC offers in order to communicate with families whose first language is not English. We also have a number of outreach strategies, including the CCR&Rs, Mass 211, as well as our coordinated family and community engagement grantees. So these are ways that we distribute information through families. And again, our licensing regulations establish requirements related to requests for reasonable accommodations for any child enrolled in an educational program that is subject to EEC licensure. So we are meeting that mandate under Section 2. Under Section 2 as well, refers to the parent complaint process. And so lead agencies under this plan have to have something in place to screen, substantiate, and respond to complaints for both CCDF and non-CCDF providers. So right now, what the EEC process is that we receive complaints through our regional office, we log and track those, and end up responding through our regional offices. And this is sufficient to satisfy that requirement, so that we're keeping that the same as prior years. Now, the other big piece, and this is something that is new, is the consumer education piece. So one of this is we must collect and disseminate consumer education information through our consumer website. And while we do this now, the requirement is a little bit more substantiated. So this includes submitting inspection reports, posting inspection reports online and any responses to those. So we need to put something in place where any reports can be available online for parents to search for. So right now, what EEC is doing is we're in the process of, we submitted a capital funding proposal in order to satisfy this requirement. Now, because of the deadline of September 30th, what we're doing is we have a short-term goal. So essentially, the first capital funding proposal will be to extend our child care search application to meet sort of the basics of this requirement. We're hopeful that after this short-term piece is met, so we can, hit the mandates of this requirement, we can ultimately have a long-term plan, which will be leveraging the mass.gov site, so we can make it much more consumer-friendly and really update that. The next piece is the Section 3 provides stable child care financial assistance to families. The major sections in this relate to the subsidy and financial assistance piece. So I won't belabor this too much. I know that we're having discussions on this related to the subsidy regulations, so I won't go into too much detail, other than to say that, as you know, we're revising our subsidy regulations, and we've gotten significant feedback from a lot of organizations, and we intend to come back here in May to go over that information.
Great.
And the next piece in Section 4 is, Section 4 here is ensure access, equal access to child care for low-income children. So here, we must ensure that families that are offered financial assistance have the access to either a voucher or a contracted slot, so they have that parental choice. So right now, EEC does have mechanisms in place where families are chosen off the wait list and offered a voucher, but however, families that are offered a contract also have the option of denying that and waiting for a voucher and not losing their place on the wait list. So we still have that mechanism for choosing whether they would like a voucher or a contracted slot. So there's nothing new in this section from the prior plan to the current plan. Also in Section 4 in the ensuring equal access is assessing market rates. Under this requirement, the lead agencies have to conduct a statistically valid and reliable market rate survey. And this is no different than prior years, so we've had to do the same as well. So right now, we are contracting with Public Consulting Group to conduct the market rate survey, and we anticipate that we'll have results of that in late May, and ultimately hoping to come back before the June board meeting so we can present those findings. moving along here, we'll get right into Section 5. So Section 5 is one of the major pieces that has changed in this new state plan. So this relates to the standards for monitoring and health and safety. So as you've probably heard before in some of these other CCDBG meetings, there's extensive changes with how EEC is going to monitor programs, and this includes annual unannounced visits, annual inspections of license exempt programs, and also ensuring that there's sufficient ratio of licensors to child care providers so that we can timely meet these inspections, these annual inspections. So currently our response to this is that we are continuing to roll out our differential licensing model, our differential licensing tool, and this allows for more focused visits so that licensors can be more efficient in these visits and conduct faster visits so they're more able to handle the increased workload. Now, we're also developing some policies and practices to allow licensors and child care providers to perform annual monitoring visits of the license-exempt CCDF providers. So we're still in the process of developing those and hope to roll those out as well. One other thing that we're doing is we will have to modify our enforcement regulations, and these are the regulations that govern how we conduct visits. So we don't expect major changes to these regulations, but to add in the requirement that license-exempt providers are subject to the annual unannounced visits. Under this section as well relates to the health and safety training. So there's substantial changes in how the agency is going to implement and conduct trainings for both health and safety and inspections. So we are required to implement pre-licensure inspection for health, safety, and fire standards. And there's going to be trainings involved in 11 different topic areas. We must have these trainings completed annually by all licensed and license-exempt providers. And we also must have providers complete this training prior to receiving care or during some sort of orientation period, so not to exceed 3 months. So they need to be done relatively quickly before getting involved with care. So where we are right now is that we have collaborated with the North Shore Community College in developing the required health and safety training modules. Right now, these are in a final review, so we're hoping to have these finalized in spring of 2018. Now, as far as how these will actually be implemented, we are working to procure and launch a learning management system that will actually house all of these trainings and will allow us to track the provider's progress. So these will all be online. One thing that EEC is considering, which is allowed under CCDBG, is to actually exempt relative caregivers from this pre-licensure inspection and monitoring requirements. So we're looking to implement that as well. The next major piece in Section 5 is related to the background record check requirements. And again, I won't go into too much detail here just because this has been a major topic before the board. The one thing that I'll note here is that, again, we are in the process of revising our background record check regulations, and we have recently filed legislation that will actually help us meet that mandate. We're also in the process of still developing our IT systems so that we can handle these new requirements. So those are all still in process.
Commissioner, can you give us an update on the legislative process?
Just thinking.
Tom, can you jump in there?
My testimony was well received. I'm sure that there will be plenty of follow-up questions, and there is at least 5 to, I'd say, 10 individuals who are lined up to testify as well behind me. So nothing material to report, but we're moving forward in the process.
Excellent.
Great. Good to hear. All right, so moving on to Section 6, this is to recruit and retain a qualified and effective child care workforce. So the major requirement under here is that the lead agency must describe its professional development framework for training, professional development, and post-secondary education. So this includes professional standards and competencies, career pathways, advisory structures, articulation, workforce information, and financing. So here, what I'd really want to do is highlight, and what we'll do in the state plan is highlight the work that we've done on the Career Lattice. I know this is information that's been brought before the board in the past. We've also applied for capital funding to develop the new IT workforce system development. So this is the learning management system. So we're in the process of developing that will kind of house the teacher qualification system as well. So we're moving towards that. And then we'll move on to section 7 here, and this is support continuous quality improvement. So the requirement here is that lead agencies must invest in quality activities based on the assessment of the state's needs to carry out those activities. And we have the flexibility to design and assess an assessment of their quality activities that best meets the needs of the department. So some of the quality activities that we'll be investing in here are improving the supply and quality of childcare programs and services for infants and toddlers, and this is including an add-on rate for providers based on their QRS level. So as you can see here, this is not something that is new, but we've done before in the past. The other quality expenditure here is evaluating and assessing the quality and effectiveness of childcare programs and services offered. And this is including evaluating how programs positively impact children, and this is through the utilization of the QRS measurement tools. And the last quality expenditure is actually developing and implementing and enhancing the quality rating and improvement system, the QRS system.
Mary.
Just a question. It says, including add-on rate for providers based on their QRIS level. And you're saying, we're already doing that? Are we already doing that?
Yep, on a very small scale. So a handful of years ago, we implemented a add-on rate for QRIS Level 2 self-assessed programs. It was done just for that particular area within the QRIS system. It's the only add-on rate that we have that is connected to the QRIS. I think it was a function of having had some additional funding at the time. It was thought to be an incremental step forward in a tiered rate structure, but it never manifested into a comprehensive tiered rate approach.
Great. So the last section here is ensuring program integrity and accountability. So under this requirement, we need to describe in our plan the internal controls to ensure program integrity and accountability. So there's no major changes here. We're going to continue to conduct risk assessment analysis, audit reports, monitoring, as well as training of providers to ensure compliance. So this is a policy that we have in place and have since the current plan. I'm going to continue that policy as well. Now, just to go into next steps here, so we do, like I mentioned before, present to the CCDF Advisory Council. The state plan to the Advisory Council. That's going to be on April 27th. As I mentioned before, we are scheduled for March, but we had to postpone. So we do intend to get feedback during that meeting and present that to the board in our next meeting. We do, as I mentioned, want to bring the draft plan back before the board for May, and the purpose there is to release it for a public comment and conduct a public hearing within the state. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the final state plan must be effective by July 1st, 2018. So I'm certainly willing to answer any questions that you might have.
Welcome, Commissioner.
Thank
Questions? Thanks so much. Any questions?
In general, does the plan function as sort of a way of delimiting our options? Like if something is not in the plan, does it mean that we can't do it? Or are there places where we're sort of purposefully broad so that we continue to have latitude? So what's the role of the plan in terms of delimiting the department's discretion?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it limits us. I mean, I think we have discretion to move outside of that. I think that we can conflict with that plan. I mean, those are the mandates by the federal government so that we can ensure that we continue to receive our funding. But for the most part, a lot of these questions are broad enough where we have flexibility to kind of go in different directions.
Thanks.
I'd just add as well is that there's pretty liberal amendment process, so to the extent that we want to make adjustments, and we have over the course of the life of the existing plan, and I'm sure that we will over the life of the next state plan, we do have the ability to go back to the federal government and ask for changes to be made. A lot of instances, those are operational changes. When we change our rates, for instance, we have to report it. They have to make an amendment to the plan. But there's opportunity, as long as we're staying within our requirements, to make further adjustments.
Great, thank you.
Anything further? Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
So that concludes our meeting. I think there's two things to mention that I didn't at the outset, which is that we're planning for June to be off-site since we missed March and we try to do 2 or 3 a year. So we'll keep in touch on that. And second, we'll be in touch very soon about scheduling the summer retreat. Commissioner, did you want to add anything? If summer ever comes, exactly, if there is such thing as sunshine.
We might just skip past spring and go right
Did you
into
want to
summer.
add anything before we close out?
No, thank you for the opportunity. I don't have anything further to report.
Okay, great. Well, we'll see you next month. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.